Okay, I think brilliant. Here I am. Right, what I'm doing tonight, I'm going to read a bit from a book called that I want to discuss called Trauma and the Soul. And I'm not going to read it all. It's a really small section from this book, which is really enlightened me on the reality of CPTSD and disassociation. The other thing I'm doing is that it's really imperative for anybody following me or watching my videos that you get this book, which is Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, because to evolve and step out of triggers and flashbacks and living in the past of the memories and the trauma that we've come from, at some point, we're going to have to understand what's going on so that we can evolve and actually get the life that we want. And this book saved me because prior to this book, I had no idea that most of my reactions that I was having every day and the feeling states that I was in was to do with childhood trauma. I disassociated for years. And the deeper I go into studying Carl Jung's work, and this particular book is Donald Cowshed, who is a Jungian, which Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, one of his followers, I suppose, at some point, and then became a therapist. And this man has blown me away with the information that he's written. I'm up to chapter 3 in this. So the other thing I will mention is that below this video, you're going to find the 14 steps for managing flashbacks and 13 steps for managing flashbacks and 14 steps for tips for managing your inner critic. Because if the inner critic is not dealt with, then we can't heal. So it's a bit complex, healing complex PTSD. But anyway, I'm going to go for a little bit that I'm going to read here. I don't know if this is really education for all of us and for me as well, that there was a gentleman called Dante who lived in the Middle Ages, and he wrote something called Inferno, which you can probably find on YouTube or you can find it on Audible. And it was about his descent into hell and purgatory. And it's really to do with the psyche. So there's this little bit that I'm reading now. I'm going to read it and then I'm going to explain what I get from it. So he says here, and this is chapter 3, page 87 of this book that I'm reading. And this is this small bit. He says, Dante's poetic insight that the violent monster at the center of hell psychologically is the psychological equivalent to the disintegrating energies of the other world, the unconscious. So the other world is our unconscious. So it's how we act out, but it's like we don't feel we have any control, so to speak. It's just things we react to and things we do. It says, helps us to relate to the poem's medieval Christian imagery to the clinical situation where we are very familiar with dis. So in the book of which I haven't read yet, I've listened to bits of it, which was Inferno, to do with Dante. There is something that's called dis, and that's to do with Lucifer, which might sound a bit strange, but Lucifer was actually of the light, but he fell. This is, history and, biblical stories and such. And he's using that as disassociation. So in CPTSD, because we go into certain states, this is what I'm trying to say, we go into certain states that we live out as adults. And the problem is that we disassociate. So we can do that through alcohol, drugs, codependent relationships. And basically, it's like living a dead life. It's like we're not really living. So he says here, disassociation, dissociative identity disorder, DID. Disavowal, disconnection, disease, even disaster, which means to become separated from your stars. And that really touched me, that bit. And I'm just going to read the last bit. Trauma is just such a disaster, and the loss of one's guiding star is equivalent to the loss of one's soul or God-given spirit, one's true spontaneous self. So when we go through child abuse, like our own, if we've been really mistreated, either verbally, sexually, emotionally, spiritually, as children, then we lose our spirit. And the whole point then is to stop disassociating and get to a point where we begin to heal ourselves and become whole, which is a lot of Carl Gustav Jung's work, believing that we have a soul. So we can probably imagine that if we take anybody, and be it a child, but even an adult, and we're abusing that person, they're going to lose their spirit and they're going to lose part of their soul. It happens in war-torn countries. It happens, in relationships that people are in. But it also happens particularly with children, because children have got no way, they've got nothing to go back to. They don't understand when they're being abused, and starting at very small ages, that there's anything, they've got no memory recall that where they can think about safety or love. They don't understand what's going on. And for many people who are now, in their 30s or 40s or 50s or even 20s, I see a lot of the younger generation now who are really, really in tune to, what's happened to them a lot earlier, where the people that have been born in the 60s, this is just my opinion, but my knowledge and what I've seen, people who've been born in the 60s, I'm only going by this because I was born in the 60s. So people that have been born in the 1960s, like I was born in 66, we're from a generation where there were, our parents generally, there was free love, and there was, free sex and Woodstock and all of that. And in the 70s, there were people doing LSD and stuff like that. So we've got different generations who understand different things. So the generation I've come from, I've noticed that a lot of people who are around my age, who are around 50, a lot of them, not small numbers, who don't want children, who don't want marriage, and they want something different for themselves. And a lot of those people as well, they've been through abuse, or they've not been nurtured fully in childhood. So from generation to generation, we have different problems that we're dealing with. I don't know what it would be like for people generally who are maybe 10 years younger than me. It would be nice to get a few people on. I've got the beauty of using Zoom is that I'm able to invite people on to speak to me. So if there is anybody that has a story and they want to talk with me on YouTube about their story, I'm happy to do that. I think the more that we speak about how trauma has disempowered us, and how, the sexual abuse and violence or unkindness and lack of nurturing has affected us, then we're going to be helping other people. I found that I would say that book there also reminds, saying that, it's like the stars are taken out of us, that the soul is stolen if somebody's been through child abuse. It's really tragic. We have PTSD that, governments are very aware of in the world. Like, it used to be called shell shock. The history of PTSD is that years ago it would have be called shell shock. So when people were in war zones, First World War, Second World War, it was called shell shock. People would come back from war and they would just not be who they were. They would have seen terrible things. And now we have an understanding of what PTSD is. It's not a disorder as much as that it's a response to events experienced. So PTSD is like generally a one-off. I'm not watering it down here because, it's tragic that people have to go through such trauma and pain. I'm giving you an example. PTSD, for example, would be like a one-off event. Complex PTSD is where somebody's been abused time and time again. We would see it possibly, to simplify, where people take animals and they abuse them, like people who abuse like a little dog or a puppy, and they're abusing that dog every day. You can see that little animal, when it's then rescued by some people that love it, or in London, it would be the RSPCA, I think it's called, where people are rescued, or an animal's rescued and people go rescue that dog. The dog will shake or try and attack because it's so afraid that it's going to be hurt. So if we're looking at a human child, and a human child is being, denied nurturing and love and kindness, we can see how messed up that is for a human being, let alone a dog. But we seem to live in a society that, is more wooing over animals, which is not a problem because it's a beautiful thing that people care for animals. But we've got loads of adults that have got trauma, who are on anxiety pills, who can't cope with life, who, are trying to make ends meet and really, really suffering. And also toxic shame, because the minute somebody says, I've been through sexual abuse, they're shamed by questions like, well, why didn't you tell anybody? Or another one is, and I've heard all of these ones myself, you know, why didn't you tell anybody? Why aren't you over it yet? What's wrong with you? You know, people who've been through abuse, they have nightmares, they have flashbacks, and they get triggered. So, for instance, if you know, if a perpetrator had a particular cologne or a particular voice or a particular look on their face or wore a particular color, you can be walking down the street, you know, 20 years after an event, and if you see somebody that looks like that person, you're going to be triggered back into that memory. Or you go to bed and you have a nightmare and flashback. And it creates such chaos in people's lives, and society doesn't seem to really be able to talk about it. They want to hush it down. You know, thank God we're in the year, you know, we're coming up to 2020. I know that in the 70s, when I was going through sexual abuse and in care as well, I would say that, you know, people did not speak about it. Children were told by you know, abusers, they weren't allowed to speak about it. There was no setup in schools to pick up on that type of behavior. So it meant that children were going to school, you know, probably, I'll give you an example. I used to sit and stare out the window constantly as a child. You know, at home, there was abuse, you know, there was sadness. And as a result of that, you know, when I went to school, I'd sit and just look out the window, like sort of dazed. And now in schools, I'm very aware that, you know, particularly in the UK, I don't know about the USA, where people are now being, you know, monitored, and, you know, that people have got a bit more aware, their eyes are open. But for the people that are my age or younger who've been through abuse, who've not been able to speak about it, and who are toxic shamed into silence, you know, why aren't you over it yet? What's wrong with you? You know, they're your parents, you've got to forgive them. You know, would we expect somebody who's been through Auschwitz and, you know, the terrible things that have happened in this world, you know, to just say, just get over it and get on with it? We need more grace in humanity and more kindness and more awareness. And it is happening. You know, I think the Catholic Church being called out recently was a huge victory for many, many people. But again, you know, people seeing that then began to, I'm not saying then, but again, but people began to stand up and say, yes, I've been sexually abused too, or I've been through, you know, trauma. It's happening with football coaches from, you know, years ago, where people who've been, you know, training in football as children are now coming forward and saying they've also been sexually abused. So the silence has to go. And, you know, there is no shame in speaking up whatsoever. So if anybody is watching out there and they're afraid to speak their truth, you know, you're safe now. Nobody can hurt you anymore. And there are groups on Facebook where people share information to begin to lift each other up. I've got a ladies group on Facebook called Anxiety and PTSD. It's Complex PTSD, and it's for women. But I do know there are groups for men also on Facebook. I know a couple where, you know, you can get help with PTSD or support, you know, people who are like-minded and understand what's gone on, where there's gentleness. And the spiritual groups I found myself tend to basically want you to surrender it all and hand it over to God and stuff like that, or just let it go. That is not the correct way to deal with CPTSD. And it's very important that people don't try and handle it that way. It's good to use, you know, the spiritual ideas like mindfulness and stuff like that, but it's not the tool that's going to take you to the level that you need to get to. What you need to do, I'm not saying what you should do or what you need to do, but it's one path. Is you get this book, and the details are below. This is by Pete Walker. It's a phenomenal book. It's like a map to get, you know, under the CPTSD under control. And the first thing Pete Walker says here is we've got to get rid of the inner critic, which is a voice in our head which makes us suffer. And then we get to grieve properly, because when we've no longer got that inner critic punishing us and telling us how crap we are, then we can go to another level. So excuse my language there, but I really need to be clear in what I'm saying. Then when we've got rid of the inner critic bit by bit, and we get to self-acceptance and self-love for ourselves and protecting our own inner child, we begin to build our self-esteem, and our esteeming self comes back, and we begin to, have love for ourselves, and we begin to protect ourselves. And then we begin to meet people who actually do care, because the minute we start caring for ourselves, we begin to weed out people that are no good for us, and then we get to move on. So it really is a process. But with this book, it took me about 2 years, the CPTSD book. It's less than 2 years. I got the book in November 2017, and it's July now. So, but then I've been doing therapy as well. I've been having therapy, which has been part of that development, and I've been reading other books. So do know that it takes time to heal, and that it's not all or nothing, that healing is not, oh, I'm going to be healed and then I'm going to be fine, because it doesn't work that way. It's a process of closing the gaps between, having flashbacks and, feeling okay and then going into a flashback and trigger. We don't know when they are going to happen. So the good news is, when you read this book, when you can monitor yourself, you'll begin to see when you're going into a flashback, and you'll be able to say that you're in a flashback, and then you'll be able to pull yourself out quicker. And then you'll be able to look at your triggers. What triggers you? Who triggers you? Are you in work that triggers you? Are you hanging around with people who are saying things to you that trigger you? Those people need to go, and they need to be removed from your life in order to heal. And that sounds, a bit harsh, but there are 7.5 billion people in the world, so we don't have to stay stuck. Even with family members, if your family were abusive to you, you don't have to hang out with them. There are no laws that say that you do. So I'm going to leave it there for today. I think I've rambled a lot. Nobody's saying, I've got 3 viewers, but I just want to say this is a very touchy subject. So what I do is that whilst I speak on this platform, you can come over to my Facebook page, or email me if you want to make a comment, and that you don't feel safe enough to comment, on a live YouTube, if that makes sense. And also the people that come on, the viewers, I can't see who is viewing. I can only see when people chat who is viewing. Timmy says, so Timmy's there. Hi, Timmy. I hope you're good. Timmy Thames, born 1967, blamed for lots, grew up with people often disappointed or angry with me. Yes, so Timmy, I was born in 66, May 1966. And our generation, Timmy, I'm not saying, I can only relate to my generation. Again, there might be people out there who are 10 years younger or 10 years older. Different generations have handled life differently because of the taboos and the things that we've been told we can't say and stuff like that. But our generation, to me, would have been, that our parents would have been the contraceptive pill, free love, one love. And really, it didn't really bring that at all, which is quite interesting. It brought a lot of chaos, because then in the 70s, we would have had the LSD and the drugs. And then as we've gone through life, there would have been the years where people were doing recreational drugs, cocaine. There's so many issues in different generations. And I would say the current generation, like the babies coming through, we've got a generation where it's nobody's fault. It's just these things happen. We can't, who do we blame? It's like technology, where parents now often, and it's not a judgment, it's just an observation on my part, where parents are walking along, they're pushing thetheir buggy and they're looking at their mobile phones. So we all have to be mindful, and particularly when people have children, it's like, that small time in the period of time in childhood, the child can't differentiate between the self and outside themselves, like mother or father. Babies completely rely on a parent to mirror them those first few years, the first 3 years. They need that mirror before they start doing their own little things and being creative and stuff like that. So we need to be aware from all angles, the receiving abuse that we've received, we need to clean that up and dig deep so we become whole. And then if we are parents, I'm not, and I've got no judgments on parents. I can't imagine how, tricky or hard that is for people as well. And clearly there are very good people in this world too. So it's just, individually looking at ourselves and helping each other to evolve the pain that is out there. Okay, thanks for mentioning that to me. I'm going to go now, and I'll be back probably tomorrow or the day after. Catch you later.